My husband laughed first. Then his lawyer laughed. Then every single person in that conference room laughed. And I just stood there with my hands folded on top of a manila envelope and said nothing. That was a Tuesday in March. By Friday, my husband had stopped laughing entirely. I did tell you what led to that moment, because none of it makes sense without the beginning. And the beginning started 7 years ago in a hospital break room in Columbus, Ohio, where I was eating a granola bar at 2 a.m. and my then boyfriend leaned across the table and told me I was the reason he was going to make it through residency. His name is Dr. Nathan Cole. That's what everyone calls him now. Dr. Cole. Even his mother. I spent 4 years calling him Nathan, then 3 more calling him my husband, and now I don't call him anything at all. When we got married, I was 26 and finishing my second year as a registered nurse at Riverside Methodist. Nathan had just matched into his internal medicine residency at the same hospital. We were broke in the specific way that young medical couples are broke, technically in debt, technically fine, running on coffee and the idea that it would all be worth it someday. I worked double shifts on weekends so he could study without picking up extra call. I made lunches and kept the apartment and handled the taxes and renewed the car registration and remembered both of our parents' birthdays every year without fail. I did all of this without resentment, because I loved him, and because I genuinely believed we were building something together. The thing about believing something that completely is that you stop questioning it. You stop watching for the cracks. You get comfortable. By the time Nathan finished residency and took an attending position at a private practice in the suburbs, we had bought a house in Worthington. Nice neighborhood. 4 bedrooms. The kind of driveway where your neighbors wave at you on Sunday mornings. I was still at Riverside, still doing 12-hour shifts, still coming home smelling like antiseptic and sometimes crying in the car before I walked through the front door, because nursing is that kind of job. Nathan had started coming home later. I told myself it was the new practice. I told myself he was adjusting. I told myself a lot of things. The first sign I actually registered was money. Not the absence of it, but the strange quiet around it. Nathan had always handled our joint account, and I had always let him because he said he was better with numbers. This was the first lie I believed so completely that I helped him tell it. I am not bad with numbers. I am, in fact, extremely good with numbers. I track medications down to the milligram. I notice when things don't add up, but in my marriage, I had decided not to notice, and that decision cost me more than I want to calculate. In January, I logged into our joint checking account to pay the electric bill and found a balance of $847. We had deposited over $12,000 the month before. I sat very still for a long time. Then I opened a new browser tab and did not say anything to Nathan. I want to be clear about something. I did not snoop because I suspected an affair. I snooped because $11,000 disappearing from a joint account is a factual emergency regardless of the reason, and I had worked too many overnight shifts building that balance to pretend I hadn't noticed. I started quiet. I pulled our statements going back 8 months. I found transfers, regular, always on Thursdays, always to an account I didn't recognize, totaling just over $47,000. Not dramatic amounts at a time. Never enough to trigger a conversation. Exactly enough to drain us slowly without me noticing if I wasn't paying attention. I was paying attention now. I didn't confront him. Not yet. What I did instead was open my own individual savings account at a credit union on the other side of the city, and I started moving my own portion of my direct deposit there every pay period. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was documented, and that mattered more than the amount. 3 weeks later, Nathan sat down across from me at the kitchen table on a Wednesday night, folded his hands, and told me he wanted a divorce. He said it the way you might tell someone the dishwasher needs to be unloaded. Calm. A little impatient, like he'd already rehearsed, moving past my reaction, and was annoyed to still be waiting for it. He said he'd been unhappy for a long time. He said we had grown in different directions. He said he hoped we could handle this like adults. I asked him what he considered adult behavior to look like. He said he'd already spoken to an attorney. He said the house was going to need to be sold, that he'd been in touch with a realtor, and that he thought it was fair for me to take my personal belongings and find an apartment while things were sorted out. I looked at him for a long moment. "You already talked to a lawyer?" I said. "I wanted to be prepared," he said. I did not wanted this to get messy. That word. Messy. Like our marriage was a spill he was cleaning up before it stained. I asked if there was someone else. He didn't say yes. He also didn't say no. He looked at the table and said that wasn't what this was about, and that told me everything I needed to know. I told him I needed a few days to process. He looked surprised, like he'd expected tears or shouting, and the absence of those things threw him. He nodded and said he understood, and he went upstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table until midnight writing down every account number, every transfer date, and every figure I had collected over the past 3 weeks. The following Monday, I called a forensic accountant named Sandra Okafor, whose name I found through a legal aid resource online. I told her what I had. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said she'd like to see the statements. I also, that same week, walked into a law office on High Street and asked for a consultation. The attorney who saw me was professional and thorough, and at the end of our hour together, she quoted me a retainer of $8,500. I had $4,200 in my new credit union account. I thanked her, walked out, and sat in my car for a long time. Then I drove home. What I did not do was panic. I want to say that clearly because I think people expect women in my position to panic, and I understand why. But panic is a luxury I couldn't afford and didn't want. I had 12-hour shifts where someone's life depended on me thinking clearly under pressure. This was pressure. I knew how to work in pressure. I filed all of my paperwork independently through the county clerk's office. Ohio allows self-representation, which Nathan's lawyer apparently found very amusing. I requested a full financial disclosure from Nathan as part of the divorce proceedings. His attorney sent back the most beautiful compliance documents I had ever seen. Every number clean, every transfer categorized as legitimate business expenses related to a medical consulting LLC I had never heard of before. I took those documents to Sandra. Sandra looked at them for about 90 seconds and said, "This LLC was incorporated 11 months ago." "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means whatever those transfers were funding," she said carefully. "The structure was built after the transfers started." I drove home and added that to my notes. Here is where I need to explain something because this is the part that people always get confused about. I did not cry. Come into that conference room the following March with a dramatic speech prepared. I did not arrive with fireworks. I arrived with a manila envelope, a flash drive, and documentation that Sandra had helped me organize over 6 weeks of working together after hours at her office on Reed Road, where she refused to charge me her full rate because, as she put it, she found the math interesting. The conference room was in Nathan's attorney's building downtown. High ceilings, glass table, the kind of chairs that communicate that everyone in the room is important. Nathan was already seated when I walked in. He had on the gray suit I had taken to the dry cleaner for him twice a year for 5 years. His attorney was a man named Richard Hale who had a firm handshake and the specific kind of competence that comes from never having lost a case he took seriously. He didn't take mine seriously. When I walked in without an attorney, Richard Hale looked at Nathan, and Nathan looked at the table, and Richard said with genuine and undisguised amusement in his voice, "Miss Cole, do you have legal representation today?" "I'll be representing myself," I said. Nathan smiled at the table. It wasn't a cruel smile. It was worse than that. It was a tired smile. Like he'd expected this. Like my inability to afford a lawyer was simply the final confirmation of every private thought he'd had about me for years. His mother was seated to his left. She had driven in from Delaware for this. She had always liked me, or I'd always believed she liked me. Until that morning when she shook her head very slightly, and I understood that Nathan had been constructing his version of our marriage for his family for a long time before he sat down at our kitchen table. Richard Hale opened a folder. He walked through Nathan's position on the house, on asset division, on the terms he considered fair. He used the word equitable 4 times. I wrote down the number 4 in the margin of my notepad. I did not cry. I did not yell back. I just looked on an X-style and walked out. And because keeping track of small details is how I stay calm. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "Do you have any response?" I opened my envelope. The first document I placed on the table was the bank statement showing the original account balance in May of the previous year. The second was a timeline Sandra had prepared, showing the progression of transfers to the LLC in 6-month intervals. The third was a printout from the Ohio Secretary of State's Business Registry showing the LLC's incorporation date, the registered agent, and the address of record, which was not Nathan's office. It was a residential address in Powell, Ohio, belonging to a woman named Courtney. Nathan stopped looking at the table. Richard Hale reached forward and picked up the printout. He read it once. He set it down. He looked at Nathan. Nathan said very quietly, "Richard." Richard held up one hand. The room was very quietly. The kind of quiet where you can hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. I watched Nathan's mother read the name on the address line from across the table, and I watched her expression shift in a way I recognized, because I had felt the same shift in my own face 3 weeks ago in the kitchen at midnight, when the numbers stopped adding up, and I understood that I had been the last person in my own life to know the truth. I placed the forced document on the table. This one was from Sandra directly, a professional summary of what she had found when she cross-referenced the LLC's declared revenue against the transfers I had documented. The LLC had declared consulting income of $20,200 over its entire 11-month existence. The transfers from our joint account into it totaled $47,400. In Ohio, marital assets transferred out of joint accounts prior to divorce proceedings are subject to equitable division. That's not my opinion. That's family law. I had read every relevant section of the Ohio Revised Code over 6 weeks in my living room after my shifts, because what else was I going to do? Richard Hale excused himself from the room. I sat very still and did not look at Nathan, because I did not want to see whatever was on his face. I had already seen it once in the kitchen in January, and once was enough. His mother, to her credit, looked at me across the glass table and said, "Megan." I didn't know. "I know," I said. That was the only conversation we had that day. Richard Hale came back 17 minutes later with a legal pad and a different posture entirely. The confidence was still there, but it was quieter now, like he was carrying it more carefully. He sat down and looked at me with the specific expression of someone who has just recalculated the room and said, "Ms. Cole, I think we should talk about what a revised settlement might look like." I said I thought that was a good idea. What followed was 2 more hours of negotiation that I won't detail entirely, because some of it is still in process, but I will tell you this. The house did not get sold out from under me. The transferred amount was factored in as marital waste under Ohio law, and a separate matter, which I had not been certain would go anywhere and had not mentioned to anyone except Sandra, was referred to the appropriate state agency, because several of the LLC's declared tax filings contained information that was inconsistent in ways that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with Nathan and his own financial decisions. I did not make a speech. I did not make a speech. I didn't need one. When I walked out of that building at 4:15 in the afternoon, the sky was doing that thing Ohio skies do in March, gray and heavy and almost purple at the edges, threatening weather that doesn't quite arrive. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and I thought about all the double shifts, all the lunches I'd packed, all the birthday cards I'd remembered and the dry cleaning I'd picked up, and the tax returns I'd filed on time every single year without being asked. I thought about the granola bar in the hospital break room and the boy who told me I was the reason he was going to make it. He made it. That part was true. He just forgot to mention that making it included a plan where I wasn't. I got in my car. I drove to Sandra's office on Reed Road. I brought her coffee from the place on 5th Avenue that I knew she liked. We sat in her office for an hour, and she walked me through the next steps, and I wrote everything down. And I felt, for the first time in 3 months, like my feet were on solid ground. There is something I want to say to anyone who is where I was in January, sitting at a kitchen table in the middle of the night with a bank statement that doesn't make sense. I am not a lawyer. I am a nurse. I am good at my job and I work hard, and for a long time I let someone convince me, very gently and very gradually, that this meant I was less capable than I was. That I needed someone else to handle the complicated things. That showing up and working and loving people quietly was somehow a smaller contribution than writing checks and making decisions and taking up more space. I want to be clear, it is not smaller. It is equal. And if you are sitting at that table right now, I want you to know that equal means it's half yours, And half yours is worth fighting for, and you do not need $8,500 in a retainer account to fight for what is half yours. You need to pay attention. You need to write things down. You need to find a Sandra somewhere in your city, because there are people who find the math interesting, and those people will help you. The laughter in that conference room lasted about 45 seconds. The quiet after the fourth document lasted much longer. I'm still living in the Worthington house while proceedings continue. The neighbors still wave at me on Sunday mornings. Last week, my next-door neighbor, a retired teacher named Dorothy, brought over lemon bread and asked how I was holding up. I told her I was doing fine. She looked at me with the particular skepticism of a woman who has been alive long enough to know what fine really means. And she said, "You don't have to be fine, honey. You can just be working on it." I thought about that for a long time after she left. She's right. I'm working on it. That's what I am, honestly. Someone who is working on it. Day by day, and shift by shift, and document by document, I am working on it. And I will tell you that there is something clarifying about having had the ground shift under you completely. Something that makes the solid parts feel more solid. Something that makes you trust your own numbers again. My name is Megan Cole for a little while longer. Then it's just Megan, and that's going to be enough.